Good evening, good night, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Deepak Biscuitwala, and on behalf of Human Development and Leadership Division, we are going to do a webinar today on the gift of quality, how to make a better by Dr. Mark Jones. Before we introduce Dr. Mark Jones, I want to talk about a bit ground rules, logistic for this webinar.
Bach, your sound is cutting out. At least people raise their hands if
Okay, can you hear me now?
That's better.
Okay. So anyway, if you have any question, please enter your question during the webinar on the right side.
You're cutting out.
Under the section.
I don't know if it's your computer or mine.
Well, I'm on the phone, Brooks. So.
Maybe I should talk because. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Brooks Carter. I'm going to take this over because Deepak has got a bad connection. Rather than deal with questions when you ask them, for the most part, we'll have 45 minutes of webinar and then 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. And write down your question when you have it. We'll save them till the end, unless we see one that really suggests that we'd be better off interrupting. Today's presenter is Mark Jones, Dr. Mark Jones. I didn't prepare to introduce him because I was expecting Deepak to do that, but I would say that he is a very, very creative and accomplished student of human development and leadership. I've learned a great deal from him in the time that we've worked together, and I look forward very much to hearing his webinar today, and I think you will enjoy it too. He has a vantage point that's frequently different from most of us, and it's very valuable. So I'm not sure. Hopefully I haven't forgotten anything. And Mark, turn it over to you.
Okay.
Do we have Mark's screen up?
We'll be doing it off of Deepak, and I'll just have him switch slides at a time. So, good evening, morning, whatever time it is for you. And today I'm going to take a big view and then focus it down. And I'm really talking about gift of quality. And I'm going to hopefully tantalize you into thinking about the idea that quality can actually make the world a better place. That it's not just something constrained or limited to thinking about how we manufacture things, or et cetera. That it actually applies to every aspect of our lives. So can you, next slide, please? So today I'm going to just use a combination of what I call old school thinking and old school models and new thinking. So when I use the term performance optimization, I'm talking about quality and process improvement, continuing process improvement, etc. When I use the term quality management, I'm actually paying respect to the old quality management systems of thinking. when I talk about human development, I'm talking about quite literally how we as humans actually develop, and what are ways that we can look at that. And there's an activity going on in the ASCCO HD&L leadership team in which we're refining our own definitions and commitments to what human development means. So we'll use tonight as a way of introducing the broad picture, and then at some point in the future you'll be able to see how we as a leadership team actually handle human development. So another piece will be just looking at the role of leadership development in terms of quality. And then I'll offer what I call a toolkit here, which may be a little different than things you've thought about, maybe the same, but we'll see. And hopefully you'll enjoy engaging with it. And then finally, I'll recap on what the gift of quality is from the perspective of this presentation. Next slide, please. So I like going back to the roots of words. And when I think of quality, I look it up and it says, a state or condition of something. So it's kind of like, is that high quality, low quality, etc. But it is actually that simple definition that we use in everyday life is actually a more applicable way of saying quality means we're changing something. If we simply hold quality as the ability to notice a state or condition, then it opens up the possibilities of how we apply quality thinking. So something that I used to teach in a master's program that was full of executives and managers, program managers, folks that were in leadership positions or heading towards leadership and organizational development. And what it boiled down to was they're saying, well, how do we actually move the dial on quality? And so I said, well, it's 4 things. First thing is what gets measured gets done. And for those of you that are in leadership positions or are actually executing quality programs, you know that if you want it to get done and it doesn't get measured, the chances of it getting done to spec are radically decreased. So what gets measured gets done. Now, the next thing was kind of almost a snarky insight, which is what gets measured and evaluated to some set of benefits gets done better. And that basically said, we're measuring this because we think here is the positive outcomes, the criteria we're looking for. So adding that why are we measuring it is really helpful. And then the last piece of that was what gets measured and evaluated the benefits with clearly specified threshold targets gets done best. So what do I mean by clearly specified threshold targets? That is when we put a range or a point in the sand that says, this is what we mean by good quality on this. So if you think about your health, your physical health, and someone will say, well, you have high blood pressure, or you have low blood pressure. This third bullet about threshold says, well, tell me specifically what high means. Tell me what the optimal is. So if someone says optimal is, 80 over 120. Oh, okay. that is much more meaningful than, high blood pressure, low blood pressure. So when we think of quality, then what we want to do is think about it in terms of clearly specified thresholds and the benefits that we're looking for. Now, the next piece I talk about from this slide is actually taking the old school definition of quality management. And for those of you that grew up with DMAIC and all those charts, you can see it: planning, assurance, quality control, and individual and organizational well-being. And the individual and organizational well-being is a piece that I've thrown in to modernize our classic definition. And the well-being part of this gets interesting, because well-being has two aspects when you look up the definitions. One aspect is that it is health, which is observable conditions. And it's, if it's a person, we would talk about physiology. If it is a part or a machine, we would talk about its structural fitness. But we couldn't measure that condition. And then we'd look at wellness, which is, highly subjective. It's how we on. Then we're basically saying it's our behavioral experience. And the positive way of thinking about it is, when we are prospering, what is the experience we're having? And when we are not prospering, what is we're having? So I like to think of it as, good signs of wellness are that we've identified and we're living into some really good causes of joy. Now, the twist I put on both of these is that I apply quality to both the individual and the organization. So quality isn't just something we do at work. Quality isn't just something I do in my personal life. It's something that we do across our lives and they impact. Next slide, please. Deepak, can I get the next slide?
I think I moved the next slide.
On so are you showing quality management?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. Good. So if we take the definitions that we were playing with up above in terms of quality as a way of looking at well-being, meaning quality is a way of looking at health of a system, being it the human system or a non-human system, or quality as looking at wellness, I just wanted to break open a little more on the well-being, and there's actually some work out there on well-being. And basically, what this piece says right here is it talks about physical or structural well-being. I'm getting an echo. Physical or structural well-being, relational well-being, vocational well-being, spiritual well-being, economic well-being, and community well-being. And again, these aspects of well-being show up in our organizational lives as well as our individual lives. And that's the setup. Next slide, please. So we should be on human development.
That is correct.
Can you, there we go. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Okay. So, in following what I said earlier about trying to begin to get more specific, what gets measured with benefits, what gets measured with thresholds, what I wanted to offer is a way of looking at those aspects of well-being and saying, well, how would I actually refine those, crunch those down so that I would actually know what it is I'm measuring and then be able to agree on how to measure it and how to move the dial. So in individual health, we basically have these ideas that show up in, you can use the sports medicine, you can use any health system, medical health system, and we get measurements and we get thresholds for physical, emotional fitness, physical safety, quality of health, quality of life, and quality of conditioning. All of these things can be measured. And therefore, we know when we're making progress or when we're regressing. When we talk about wellness, we can look at the dimensions that show up in the wellness models. Like that I just mentioned, occupational, physical, social, etc. When we talk about it at an organizational level, this is where things get interesting. I suggest that the way we measure organizational health is to use the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award criteria, the performance excellence criteria. And they're very, very specific about these are the major categories: leadership, strategic planning, customer focus, measurement analysis, knowledge management, workforce focus, operations focus, and then summation of results. So what I do when I'm doing business transformation work, change management work, is I actually start to grid that out. And the Baldrige system has an application that people fill out, and I use the application as a template for getting people to understand how well do you understand your overall organizational system, and how well articulated and structured is your organizational system. So I'm offering the suggestion to you that you actually go out and you play with the Baldrige system and not be overwhelmed by what seems to be, it's not complex, but it's deep. I think I'm a Baldrige assessor at a regional level, and one of the things that I ran into in a review once was an organization that had actually done the assessment a couple times, and they had actually adopted the MBNQA criteria for their entire planning system. And it was incredible to see what they did and how they did it. So that's organizational health, kind of a new take. That's why I'm spending a little time on it. Organizational wellness. In my way of thinking, what we're really trying to deal with is the emotional, social, cultural, cognitive, and organizational behavioral competencies. And this sometimes doesn't get enough attention, and in business transformation, change management, let's say we're bringing in a new lean initiative or something, the organizational wellness elements gets missed, and people are aware that folks are anxious, maybe even angry, but they don't measure it. They don't go after it. They don't actually engage folks to say, what is this really about for you? And that leads us to sort of the relational well-being. What's going on in this system that's impacting you relationally? A lot of times, the anxiety is, well, if we do this change, I might lose my job. That's a really big deal, right? So all of these things need to be considered when we're doing change. And if we hold quality as carrying all of these elements, then I think we're way ahead of the game in terms of any type of quality work we're doing. Vocational well-being, I like to think of it as individuals and organizations that are dedicated to learning. That in previous jobs that I've had and in my consulting work, one of the things that I like to say is, my organizations or I myself want to challenge myself and our organization to be able, if it's in a competitive modality, to be able to outlearn the competition. If it's in a collaborative modality, to be able to learn with and as fast as possible with our partners. So learning, I think, is an essential ingredient of quality. Constantly prototyping, if you will. Spiritual well-being shows up, I think, in an interesting way. Organizations that are under stress, i.e., we're going to do this change management because we have to reduce costs by such and such and increase shareholder value by such and such, etc., that there's actually a question of the core values of the organization at stake. And if that gets missed, then you have really angry employees, if you're a leader, because they're saying what you're doing is a betrayal to our understanding of our relationship with this company. So in the category of human development, this category of quality, it's really important to not only not ignore that, but to put special attention on. Economic well-being, in a way, I think organizations are much better off when the stovepipes within the organizations are not actually fighting each other. So economic well-being increases when there is a sense of community across an organization. Economic well-being increases for people who actually are in relationships that have social capital to them. So at both the individual and the organizational level, economic well-being is an idea and an experience that is dependent on our relationships with others. And when we try to separate the economic aspects away from the relational aspects, mischief occurs. So lastly, there's community well-being is actually going deeper into what are the narratives that drive this behavior, drive the organization, drive behaviors in the organization. For instance, if a company has a narrative that says, let's say, there can only be one. So that means that company's, its motto is to eliminate competition. Well, that motto, that meme, can also start to drive behaviors within the company and set up structural situations in which organizations and people are competing against each other in ways that actually are highly detrimental. Or another common one is do more with less. which generally gets tagged on to people that do quality or process improvement. Well, you got to do more with less. That can drive behaviors, and I'm sure those of you that have been in this arena, that can drive behaviors that are actually destructive. So from a human development perspective, we're saying we have to look at these things, we have to understand how they play out. Next slide, please. So kind of two things here. One of the pieces that intrigued me with the Baldrige work was this notion that the Baldrige system had a long time ago that said basically leadership drives the systems that get results. Now, isn't that interesting? I wonder, I believe it from my own experience, but I wonder if there's any way of substantiating that more empirically. So back in the 2000s, people that were associated with Daniel Goleman, the emotional intelligence folks, Hayes Group, etc., they were running a number of people through PhD programs at, I think it was Case Western. And Elizabeth Coleman Stubbs did her dissertation, and the key thing that came out of it was that leaders set the emotional behavioral norms of their organization. Now, when I say it and you reflect on it, you go, like, yeah, I guess that's true. What it means to a leader is a little frightening, because if a leader tolerates people screaming at each other, people treating each other with contempt, people interrupting each other, people having to be hyper punctual or not punctual at all of these things that the leader, quote unquote, tolerates or reinforces, that's what happens in the organization. That's how the organization performs. So if, from a leadership perspective, if you want to change behaviors of an organization, you as a leader have to change your own individual behaviors, the things that are observable and the things that you set. And I think that's a really big deal. And it kind of serves up the holy grail of leadership development. Like, why is leadership development important? Because leaders set the emotional behavioral norm. So that leaking into that is leaders therefore reinforce or establish the cultural means. So earlier on I talked about do less with more. So if a leader is constantly on different variations of do less with more, do less with more, do less with more, do less with more, eventually it's going to become overwhelming for people that have to do the work with less. And, they're working 80, 90 hours, maybe. That is probably not a good long-term or sustainable solution for the work. And the leader's saying, why are people getting burned out? Well, what are the means that you are reinforcing in this company? How are you behaving in this company that's doing it? So leadership development becomes a key element of all of this. Next slide, please. So you saw the letters earlier, HISL, hear, seeing, love, hearing, seeing, loving, and a real quick piece on that. Back in 2001, I had the opportunity to visit the Dalai Lama in India. And one of the things he laid out a logic stream around relationships, let's put it that way. He said, what is critical to understand is the path from sympathy to empathy to compassion, or compassion in this case being unconditional love. But what he said is everyone, and he has that everyone, wants and needs to be heard, seen, and loved in that order. And then he said, and when that is thwarted, and he bursts out laughing and giggling, he says, mischief occurs. So his assignment to me was to go out and live that. And I was an organizational person, so what would that look like in organizations? What would that look like in interpersonal relationships? I think so. The first part of it is fairly straightforward. If we were all live right now in terms of being able to talk to each other across this webinar, you would be interacting with me, and I would be interacting with you. Let's say someone said, "Well, what about such and such?" And I would say, "So let me make sure you're asking X." I would paraphrase you to make sure I at least heard you, and you would verify or you would correct my understanding at that level. That's the minimal thing, is making sure that I'm hearing you and you're hearing me hear you. The seeing is sort of the magic zone. So you say something, I'm taking it in, I ask you probably for the story behind it so that I get a fuller understanding of your experience, and then I would play it back to you, and then I would play it back to you again saying, so in my life, the story you just told, here's the story, and is this similar? Is this the same as what you're describing, or is it different? And then we'd go back and forth until you could say, you got me. Yes, you're getting me. We're on the same track here. So the seeing is you seeing me, seeing you. Super, super important. Hearing doesn't build trust between people. Seeing does. So when you see me seeing you, that's when trust is being built. And if we don't take our conversations, our interactions with each other to that level, we don't get trust. And trust is the relational currency for people. The last part of it, the unconditional love, I use the example about children. And let's say I have a toddler or a child in the age that is acting out, as we put it, and I put that in quotes in the air quotes. I might be tempted to just say, go stand in the corner, basically, and cool off. So go into the cooling off corner, or however we'd structure it. And this applies to adult employees too, by the way. But that is actually not what this Hizzle tool says. So with the child, I would sit down next to them, and they would do what I call the come here, go away game. It's like, leave me alone, but then keep looking at me and then looking away. Well, leave me alone. The magic here is that when I've done this consistently with children and adults, the equivalent scenarios, I sit there, and my message of being there is, I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. You mean enough to me that my annoyance is irrelevant. I'm here, and I'm staying here. With kids, eventually the child, and I think you might have experienced this, maybe their knee leans into you, and then eventually they're leaning into you, then eventually you're holding them. Because the question they were in is, am I loved? Now, it's easy to see that for kids, but the same thing happens for adults. It's just we don't tend to go to that area of, okay, this person's upset, and what they're really saying is, do I matter to you? Do you love me? So I believe this is a critical element of quality. This is, again, it's on the relational side of things. So the person that is a diagnostic I use, let's say someone is screaming, then the HISL approach would be to put your total attention, rather than ignore their screaming, put your total attention on them and start paraphrasing so that they get that you're at least hearing them. And the screaming stops. My experience is the screaming stops. They were screaming because they weren't being heard. Let's say a person is, I call it in your face. Basically, I call it bullying. They're in your face. You know, but inclination might be to go away or push them out of the way. But the HISL response is to lean in and to make sure that you're seeing them. Because when somebody is bullying you, they're basically saying, see me, see me, see me, see me. Do you see me? So we cut right to the core. Yeah, I see you. The behavior stops. And I would invite you to prototype this, to check with it. Then send emails back to us. Send emails back to me, you know, on your experience. And of course, I use the example of the child. So I believe that HISL is an important part of relational well-being. You heard me talk about the Baldrige piece earlier, and again, I'll just emphasize, I really encourage you to play with it. And I briefly mentioned ESCCO, you know, and I'm mentioning it in terms of behavioral competencies. And if you're interested in follow-ons with that, I would invite you to actually engage our HD&L leadership team, because these are the conversations we're in. What is human development? What are the emotional competencies? And, you know, how do we improve the quality of life, right? So the last piece is the tool that I alluded to, which is the implicit narrative. What is the meaning behind it? What is the story where you might be saying, I should do this, or you're holding back on something, you know the stand that you're taking, no one else knows it. That's an implicit narrative to everyone else. It's explicit for you. Or you are actually operating from something you're not even aware of. You know, sometimes it shows up as bias. Sometimes it simply shows up as, here is a reaction that you have to these types of situations. As we start to tease those out, as we learn how to identify those meanings, those narratives, things get easier just through awareness. So, next slide, please. There is the HISL. I'm not going to go through it again. But you're on the webinar. I just want you to be able to see the words and then put them to the words I was saying. And just pay attention to, one way to play it is when you get riled up personally, you know, have you gone through the chain of because you're feeling unheard, unseen, or unloved? And if you're feeling unloved in the situation, then it literally means that whoever you're dealing with you have to get it all the way back to being heard first and then seen, because the trust comes in seen. Next slide, please. So these are the criteria, performance criteria for Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award System. And you can glance through those. You can see, you know, the elements of leadership, and in the assessment process, in the way they lay out the criteria, there are very, very specific. very specific things that they're looking for. And it's marvelous. You don't have to guess what should senior leadership be doing. Well, senior leadership should be doing these things, right? So your organization should be doing these things and have a record of it. So in each of these elements, it allows you to take a comprehensive, systematic, and I'm being redundant, systemic view of the organization. Next slide. In the behavioral competencies, basically we're looking at competency around personal mastery, and this covers things like cognitive or emotional flexibility. Big. That's in one way. Another way of saying that is the ability to hold multiple perspectives. We're actually also talking about self-awareness, and what gets interesting about self-awareness itself is self-awareness plays a huge role in situational awareness. So if you think of the broader thing, situational awareness, then like where pilots are in trouble, right? Part of the situational awareness training that they try to get is to be aware of their own reactions, their own responses to what's going on, so as well as what's outside of them. So that's group 2 covers all of that. Critical thinking, of course, is critical. And I can also think of it as the research approach to things, but I add one juicy element. We talk about logic, and we usually are talking cognitive logic. I maintain that there's also something called emotional logic. And, so if you're walking down the street, someone walks up to you, screams at you and slaps your face, and you don't know them, there is a certain emotional logic to how you would respond. I would expect, a reasonable person would expect you to, have some sense of fear emerge, some anxiety, and B, probably get pissed, right? So that is just, again, adding another element. So critical thinking includes, in this case, your cognitive processes and your emotional processes. And then group 4 is, what are the things you do that actually cultivate trustworthiness? If you're not trusted as a leader or in any role, it's not a good thing for you personally or for the system you're in. Next slide. This second group, interpersonal mastery, is what happens what happens between people. So you can see in group 1, we're talking about empathy. We're talking about being aware of the impact of your own words, your own behaviors, and asking and sharing the impact of other people. Simple skills, not generally practiced. Group 2 is deep into this learning thing that I was talking about. In order to learn, you actually have to be curious. And when you wire yourself to learn, you actually get the joy out of learning itself, which becomes an intrinsic motivator for doing any work. The third one is, talks about caring, connectedness, if you will, belonging. If you've ever been in a team in which people didn't want to be there and didn't want to be with each other, you get just the opposite of what we're talking about in group 3. And the team usually doesn't perform well. Next slide, please. At an organizational level, organizational mastery, these are the classics that you get in leadership and management books, right? Leadership and management courses. You know, the whole vision thing. It's your core functions in change management, human resources, etc. I won't go into most of these because you're familiar with them. If you've been in the business world, you're familiar with them. The one I will ask you to actually note, though, is Group 5, Awareness of Organizational Political Landscape. Execute awareness and then be able to execute power leveraging strategies. Tracking, stewarding the relational capital. These are things that people that understand organizations well do, but they may not articulate this is what they're doing. So I'm putting this out there for you to play with. People that move well in and around and through organizations probably have some mastery of these Group 5 skills. And you could too, if you're not one of them already. Next slide, please. Next slide. To INA cultural meaning. There we go. So these are examples. Now, there was a time where I actually was supporting NASA. I was actually there when Challenger blew up. And words like the actual phrase failure is not an option, which presumably came from the Apollo era, weren't quite actually said initially. However, that meme was adopted. And so in the NASA culture of the mid-'80s, and then we get into the 90s, it was still there, but it was failure is not an option. And, you know, these types of cultural memes, they can drive positive results and they can drive negative results. And you simply need to pay attention to what's going on. Like no pain, no gain, right? Well, does that mean that in order to gain, I have to be in physical pain or emotional suffering? You know, it kind of heads that way, and it may actually say, well, that's how you need to interpret it, right? So if you're not, you know, so quit complaining about your suffering because no pain, no gain. So this is just to get you to start naming the cultural means in the organizations or the communal systems that you are participating in, and then decide how you want to respond to them. Next slide. So I mentioned should, undisclosed stands, and declared stands. That's all part of the implicit narrative analysis, where if you find yourself saying should, take note, there's a narrative at play. And you know, the way to backtrack it or track it down is, you know, when you say, well, I should be doing this. Why? Right? Well, because why? So 7 whys usually gets you much closer to understanding that there's something much deeper going on than the should. And it may actually have to do with your own sense of identity or the organization's sense of identity, etc. Next slide. So the existential level issues, these are the big ones. And these questions, in my research, I've found that not only do they get asked by individuals, but they actually play out fully in organizations. You know, so one of the things I noticed over time with my master's students was that if they were answering no to any 2 of these categories, yeah, am I loved? No. You know, Am I in a relationship? Not really. They were depressed. So I actually had some folks check, I had that checked out. And now this was the scary part for me. If an individual had a no answer in at least 3 of the categories, they were actually they were suicidal, or they had suicidal ideation. And that's what woke me up. I mean, it really woke me up. So I started to pay a whole lot of attention, and I pay a whole lot of attention to how people are interacting with the world in terms of these types of narratives. It always boils down to these narratives. Next slide, please. So, what is this thing that I've called the gift of quality? Well, the gift is that as a leader, you can know that you can be developed and set positive emotional behavior norms. Hopefully, every one of you, whether you're in a formal leadership position or an opinion leader or whatever role you play, oh, right, how I behave, how I am experiencing and expressing my emotion actually impacts the people around me. And I would put period, exclamation point, period. And now you're in choice with that awareness. So then you get to, once you're in choice, you get to decide what you're going to reinforce or what you're going to change in terms of those needs, in terms of the protocols you're using to interact with people, or in terms of your own behaviors or their behaviors. Now, people can be trained to improve their own physiological fitness. We know that. We go to the gym all the time, right? And organizations can be trained to improve their structural fitness. That's like going through MBNQA ways of assessment and planning and execution. The cooler thing about the joy or the quality of the gift of quality is that people and organizations, they can actually improve their subjective and behavioral experience. They can actually experience abundance. They can notice joy, causes of joy. And I'll finish this off. I realize I'm running a little late. I'll finish this off by saying, years ago I was at a conference, and I'm listening to a group of fairly high-ranking folks across government, nonprofit, and private sector organizations. And I finally just said, I think what I'm hearing you say here is that the measure of leadership in the room is actually the amount of joy in the room. So the measure of leadership of an organization is how much joy you see and experience in the organization. So if you play with those as the gift of quality, that's the gift of quality. So that completes my talking head section. And we'll see if there are any questions to be had or to be played with.
Mark, I don't have any on my screen.
From my side, I don't see any question on my screen either. So while we are waiting for question,
Here we go. We got one.
Okay, go ahead, Brooks.
Unfortunately, Dr. Jones, thanks for sharing. This is in a narrow window. I have to keep scrolling. Thanks for sharing difficult concepts in a structured way. The question is why, despite leaders being aware of all these, still consider business is about making money for shareholders. The even worse is to do it in the short term.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'll paraphrase. Even with leaders that know some of the things that I've been talking about, why do they continue to focus on increasing shareholder value, right? As an economic measure, as the economic measure, and use things like return on net assets, RONA, which locks them into short-term gains. Well, here's the cool thing, because in that moment, the organization, the leaders are actually being driven, right, by the means of short-term gains above everything else, and that's the dotted part of it. The short-term gain above everything else. So if an organization is doing the MBNQA approach, running through those criteria, that gets broken down, because part of what MBNQA is looking at is 5-year windows, at least 5-year windows. If you're a startup, then you're having to predict where you're going to be. So it shifts the focus from you have to make money right now at all costs to, yes, the best way to make money is for the organization and the people in the organization to be healthy. This is how we measure it, and these are the trends that we're looking at, and these are what competitors are doing, on and on and on. So I think that the Baldrige approach actually weans organizations off of a short-term focus at all costs. That would be my answer.
Mark, thank you very much for that answer. While we are waiting for another question, I want to just acknowledge that on the right side panel in the chat section, we have a survey link. While we are going to the question, please take the survey. So your feedback is very important. So next question is, I think this is a very good comment from Elizabeth, saying, Mark, thank you. You affirm my belief that people are the greatest asset of the organization. So that's a very good comment, and it is very true.
I'd actually like to respond to that one, Deepak.
Sure.
People are actually the only sustainable asset of the organization. There is no organization without people. And so thank you for the comment. And yeah, it's huge when if you take out all the people in an organization, we don't have an organization. Even if we program a bunch of robots, we don't have an organization. Okay, keep going, Deepak, please.
How do we increase? How do we increase motivation on the bottom levels if the upper levels are not motivated?
So I'm going to twist that question a little and say, how do we increase motivation on the bottom levels if we aren't sure what is motivating the upper levels? Because the behaviors that are happening at the top of the organization are driven by cultural means. So if we understand those cultural means, then we can begin even at the bottom level. Even if I am someone deep in the trenches, if I understand the means that are driving the CEO, the CFO, the CIO, the CTO, whatever, then I can begin to say, okay, these are the types of results they're looking for, but we don't have to achieve those results the way they are thinking. And so, by collaborating, and I do mean collaborating at the lower levels, a group of people that becomes a high-performance team becomes more immune to the vagaries of expressiveness of the overall organization. But the organization says, wait, this is high performing, we don't want to mess it up. And so my answer would be team up with folks in your organization, create norms between you, understand what is being measured through the system, and get and hit those measures through ways that are healthy for you, healthy for your group, healthy for your inner collection of groups.
I suspect you would agree heartily with me that the ultimate guide is your own ethics and morality.
Yeah.
And that's also the source of trust.
Yep.
So there's only so far you can go.
So Deepak, if you can hit one more slide for a moment. Next slide.
Sure. You want to go back or forward? I'm on the last.
Go forward. Next slide. Next slide down.
This one?
So, yes, I had mentioned earlier, and you saw a reference to NWI, National Wellness Institute. Just so you know, in this presentation, there is an institute out there that a lot of folks look at to help them understand what wellness is. So they have their 6 dimensions of wellness. This is a sort of so that there are places you can go look. And yeah. Any other questions?
I don't see any other questions, and I think we should let you go. I really appreciate, I enjoyed it very much. And as usual, it was a learning experience.
So before we conclude this webinar today, I want to just make sure that people are aware of this. We will post this recording of this webinar on our Human Development and Leadership website, and also this PowerPoint. We will highly recommend that when you receive the email about your CU credit, we will also include our survey link. Please take your time and fill out the survey. That's very important for us. Again, thank you very much. And Mark and Brooks, thank you very much for helping me. And sorry about some technical difficulty today.
And you're welcome, and it was a pleasure being here.
And good night.
Bye.